You open your eyes. The first thing you notice is the smell. Not a single smell. A layered, complex, deeply committed collection of smells, arriving all at once, without introduction, without the courtesy of building gradually so that your brain can adjust. Wood smoke, animal, something fermented that might be food or might be something that used to be food and has since had second thoughts about the arrangement. Wet earth, wet wool, the specific biological output of human beings who have been living, working, sleeping, and existing in close proximity to each other and their animals for an extended period with limited access to anything that functions like a bathroom. You are in a Viking Age longhouse. The second thing you notice is the noise. It's not quiet here, not even close to quiet, despite the fact that based on the light, thin, gray, seeping through gaps in the structure around you, it's early morning. There are animals, closer than any animal has any right to be to a sleeping person by any reasonable standard. There are people, many of them, in various stages of waking up. There is a fire. There is always a fire. In a longhouse, burning in the central hearth that runs the length of the building, because the fire is the heating system, the cooking system, and the light source simultaneously. And letting it go out is not a minor inconvenience, but an actual problem. The fire has been burning all night. Someone's job was to keep it burning all night. That someone is now awake, which means everyone nearby is now also awake, whether they wanted to be or not. The third thing you notice is that you are cold despite the fire, because the longhouse is large, and the fire, while real and present and genuinely burning, is dealing with a volume of space and a quality of insulation that would challenge a much more sophisticated heating system. And the end of the building where you apparently slept is not the end where the fire is most effective. You have been transported. Call it whatever you'd like. A time machine, a cosmic accident, an extremely realistic dream that you are now deeply invested in surviving. To somewhere in Scandinavia. Norway perhaps, Denmark, the Swedish coast. Somewhere cold, green, and dramatically beautiful in a way that you would genuinely appreciate if you weren't immediately preoccupied with the realization that you have absolutely no idea how to survive here. The year is somewhere in the range of 850 to 1000 CE. The Viking Age is in full swing, and you have one day, from this cold gray dawn to the cold gray dark of evening, to make it through without the world around you ending your participation in it. You're not going to make it. I want to be upfront about that. This is not a story with a triumphant ending where your modern resourcefulness and can-do attitude carry you through. This is a story about the specific, comprehensive, fascinatingly detailed ways in which the Viking Age is calibrated to destroy someone like you. Someone from the modern era. Someone who grew up with central heating and supermarkets and antibiotics, and the basic assumption that other people, by default, mean you no harm. Every one of those assumptions is about to be stress tested. So let's go through your day, hour by hour. Challenge by challenge. Let's trace exactly what the Viking Age is going to throw at you, why it's going to throw it, and what it reveals about the people who actually lived here. People who were not superheroes, not cartoon barbarians, not the horn-helmeted caricatures of popular imagination, but something considerably more interesting. Ordinary human beings who had been shaped, from birth, by one of the most demanding physical and social environments in the medieval world. They belonged here. Every cell of them, every skill, every habit, every reflex was calibrated for this place and this life. You do not belong here. Let's find out exactly how that plays out. Chapter 1. The Longhouse. Your new home is trying to kill you. Slowly, let's start with where you are, because where you are is already quietly working against you in several ways simultaneously. The Viking Age, Longhouse, Langhus, was the primary dwelling of Norse society across all social levels, from the modest farmer's home to the great mead hall of a powerful chieftain. The concept was consistent even when the scale varied enormously. A long, rectangular building, wider in the middle than at the ends, constructed from whatever materials were locally available. Timber framing with wattle and daub infill in some regions, turf walls in Iceland, and Greenland where timber was scarce, post and plank construction in areas with abundant wood. The roof was typically turf or thatch over a timber frame, heavy, low-sloping, designed to shed snow rather than rain primarily, because in Scandinavia, snow is the more serious structural threat. The building you're in is maybe 30 meters long and 7 or 8 meters wide. Along the interior walls, raised platforms, sleeping benches, covered in furs and woven wool blankets, run the full length. This is where everyone sleeps. The family, the household servants, the farm workers, any guests, and in the section nearest the entrance, separated by a low partition or simply by proximity, some of the animals. Not all the animals. The larger livestock has its own byre attached to or near the main structure, but some of them, because their body heat contributes to the warmth of the space, and because in a Norse winter, keeping valuable animals from freezing is not optional. This animal cohabitation is not a sign of poverty or primitiveness. It is a rational response to the climate. It is also, by every modern measure of indoor air quality and sanitation, catastrophic. The animals contribute to the atmosphere of the longhouse in ways that are olfactory, biological, and structural. The floor, packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes, straw, or heather, absorbs everything that falls on it from both human and animal contributors. It is changed periodically, but periodically in a pre-modern household means not nearly as often as you're currently hoping. The smoke. We need to talk about the smoke. There is no chimney. There is a hole in the roof above the central hearth, a liori, a roof opening that allows some smoke to escape. Some, not all, not nearly all. The rest of the smoke from the central fire, which burns continuously, distributes itself throughout the interior of the longhouse in a permanent, low-lying haze that stains the roof timbers black, deposits a layer of soot on every surface, and is breathed constantly by everyone inside. Medieval Scandinavians had respiratory systems that had adapted somewhat to this through lifelong exposure. Their lungs were accustomed to functioning in conditions that would send a modern person reaching for an inhaler. You have not had this adaptation. Your respiratory system, calibrated for modern air quality standards, is currently registering strong objections in the form of stinging eyes, an irritated throat, and the beginning of a cough that is going to become a recurring feature of your day. The light is bad. The smoke in the air scatters what little daylight enters through the roof opening and the small gaps in the structure. At night, the light sources are the fire and oil lamps, small stone or clay dishes with a wick-burning animal fat that provide a warm, flickering, deeply insufficient illumination. The Vikings were not reading by lamplight. They were navigating the darkness of their own homes by memory and familiarity. You have neither. Now let's talk about temperature, because this is January. Let's say it's January, because January in Scandinavia during the Viking Age is the full expression of what Scandinavian winter is capable of. And the outside temperature is somewhere between -10 and -20 degrees Celsius, depending on the specific location and the specific year. The longhouse, despite the fire, despite the animals, despite the collective body heat of 24 human beings, is cold. Not outdoor cold, survivably warm, especially near the hearth, but cold in the way that seeps into you over hours. The kind of cold that your modern body, accustomed to indoor temperatures of 20 degrees or above, is not going to tolerate gracefully. You are already cold. You've been cold since you woke up. The sleeping furs that someone draped over you, or that you found, or that were simply the nearest available bedding, have kept the worst of it at bay through the night. But now you're sitting up, and the air is hitting you, and your body is doing the calculation and finding the numbers alarming. Here's what you're wearing. Whatever you arrived in. Modern clothes, modern fabrics, modern footwear. Let's say jeans and a jacket, because that's what a lot of people are wearing at any given moment. Your jacket is probably some kind of synthetic, polyester, nylon, a technical fabric of some kind. Your jeans are cotton. Your footwear is modern. Here is the problem with all of those materials in this environment. Cotton, as outdoor survival specialists have been saying for decades, kills. It absorbs moisture, from sweat, from precipitation, from the general ambient dampness of a Norse winter. And when wet, it loses its insulating properties almost entirely and actually draws heat away from your body faster than having no clothing at all. Your jeans, on a day that involves any exposure to snow, rain, or the simple condensation that comes from moving between cold outdoor air and the relatively warmer air of the longhouse, are going to be wet and cold within hours. And they're going to stay that way because there's no tumble dryer here, no radiator to hang them on, no warm room to change into dry clothes in. Synthetic fabrics are better than cotton in this regard. They don't absorb water the same way, but they have their own issues with the Viking environment. They are visually, textually, obviously wrong in ways that will mark you immediately as something other than what you should be. And they're not as warm as the layered wool that the people around you are wearing, because wool, which the Vikings wore in multiple layers, from fine inner garments to coarse outer ones, is the genuine cold weather miracle fabric. It insulates when wet. It breathes. It regulates temperature across a range of conditions. Viking Age Scandinavians had developed a textile culture of considerable sophistication because their survival literally depended on getting clothing right. Your clothing is not right. This is going to matter more than you currently think it does. The longhouse is waking up around you. It happens fast. There's no alarm, no snooze button, no gentle gradient from sleep to wakefulness. The Norse woke up because the fire needed attention, because the animals needed feeding, because the day's work was structured by the available daylight, and daylight was scarce in winter, and none of it could be wasted. People move with the purposeful efficiency of individuals who know exactly what they need to do and need to start doing it immediately. Everyone around you has a role, a specific, understood, expected function in the household's daily operation. The woman at the far end of the building is already at the fire, managing something that will eventually become the morning meal. The older man near the door is pulling on outer clothing with the practiced speed of someone who does this every day and has optimized every movement. The younger men, they look like farmhands or household warriors, it's hard to tell at this stage, are already in motion toward the attached byre where the animals are. And you are, sitting on the sleeping bench, in your cotton jeans and your obviously wrong jacket, with smoke in your eyes and cold in your bones, trying to remember if there's anything you know about Viking Age Scandinavia that might be immediately useful. There probably isn't, but let's find out. The first practical challenge arrives faster than expected, and it's embarrassingly basic. You need to use a bathroom. There isn't one. There is, somewhere outside a designated area. The concept of sanitation existed. The Norse were not as indifferent to hygiene as certain popular depictions suggest. But the implementation was a far cry from anything you'd recognize. Outside, in January, in the dark, in minus 15 degrees, with snow on the ground, and the wind coming off whatever body of water is nearest. Welcome to your first practical test of the Viking Age. It is not glamorous. It does not involve swords. It does not appear in any saga, but it is absolutely comprehensively real. And your ability to cope with it, and with its absence of all the infrastructure you've spent your entire life taking completely for granted, is going to set the tone for everything else that follows. You get up. The cold hits you properly now. Standing, the sleeping bench was at least above the coldest layer of air near the floor. You move toward the door. Someone glances at you. You can't read the expression. Neutral, you think. Maybe mildly curious. You are clearly a stranger. Clearly not from here. Clearly something that requires explanation at some point. But the household has accepted your presence overnight, which means someone vouched for you, or the social codes of hospitality are providing temporary protection. For now, you push through the door. The cold outside is a different category of cold from the cold inside. It's not merely a lower temperature. It's a total environmental commitment to the proposition that you should not be here, expressed through wind that finds every gap in your clothing simultaneously. and a dry, biting quality to the air that makes your nose hurt with the first breath and your eyes water within seconds. The sky is lightening, barely grudgingly, the way Scandinavian winter skies lighten, as if the sun is present only under protest and reserves the right to withdraw at any moment. The landscape around the longhouse is white and gray, snow on the ground, dark timber of outbuildings, the silhouettes of bare trees against a sky that hasn't decided yet what color it wants to be. It is beautiful. Genuinely, starkly, completely beautiful. You notice this even through the cold and the discomfort and the pressing biological imperative that brought you outside, because the Viking Age landscape is one of the things it gets right, unambiguously, without caveat. But beauty doesn't keep you warm, and you are very cold, and the day hasn't started yet. Chapter 2. Food. The morning meal and the nutritional reality of Viking life. You've made it back inside. Your body has registered its objections to the outdoor experience in comprehensive and anatomically specific terms, and you are now standing by the central hearth, as close to the fire as the social geometry of the room allows you to get without obviously displacing someone who has more right to be there than you do. The smell of the fire is different up close. Wood smoke, yes, but also something cooking. Something in a large iron pot suspended over the hearth, stirred occasionally by the woman managing the breakfast production. And your stomach, which has been making theoretical complaints since you woke up, is now making specific and urgent ones. You are hungry, deeply, persistently hungry, in the way that comes from a combination of not eating recently, your body working overtime to generate heat against the cold, and the stress response of being in an entirely alien environment with no clear path forward. What's for breakfast? The answer is something. Probably porridge, because porridge, made from whatever grain was available, oats or barley or rye, cooked into a thick paste with water or milk, was the cornerstone of the Viking Age morning meal. It was calorically dense, warming, filling, and could be made from stored grain throughout the winter when fresh food was unavailable. It is not a meal that a modern person accustomed to a varied diet would describe as exciting. It is a meal that a modern person who has been standing outside in minus 15 degrees for 10 minutes would describe as the best thing they've ever seen. If there's milk to add, the porridge is richer and more nutritious. If there's salt, and salt was valuable, traded across considerable distances, not casually abundant, the porridge has flavor beyond its baseline grain character. If there's dried fruit or honey, or any of the various additions that a prosperous household might have access to, the meal improves accordingly. You get a wooden bowl, you get a portion of porridge. Someone hands it to you with the practical efficiency of a household managing its resources. Not unwelcoming, but not elaborately hospitable either. You exist in a zone of provisional acceptance, tolerated rather than embraced, present rather than celebrated. You eat. It is genuinely good, in a simple, filling, straightforward way. The warmth of it is the main thing. The warmth going down, the warmth in the bowl in your hands, the warmth of being close to the fire while eating it. For a few minutes, the morning achieves something close to manageable, and then it's over, and the business of the day begins, and you need to figure out what your role in it is, because in the Viking Age, longhouse, everyone has a role. Everyone contributes. The concept of a person simply existing within a household without contributing to its functioning was not a recognized social category. Children worked. Elderly, people who could no longer do heavy labor, did lighter tasks. Guests, who stayed more than briefly, were expected to make themselves useful in ways appropriate to their abilities. You have not established what your abilities are. This is a problem that's going to require solving before too long, because the household around you is already organized into its daily task structure. The women managing the indoor work of cooking, textile production, childcare, and household management. The men moving toward the outdoor work of animal care, firewood collection, farm maintenance, and whatever specialized craft or trade the household practiced. And the slot for confused stranger of unclear origin and no apparent useful skills. is not one that exists in this organizational chart. Let's talk about what the Viking Age food system actually looks like across a full day, because your survival, and I mean that literally, not metaphorically, depends substantially on your relationship with it. The Viking Age diet was, for most people, most of the time, adequate in calories and limited in variety. Grain was the foundation. Bread, porridge, flatbread, cooked directly on the hearth. In Scandinavia, the grain was primarily barley, with oats in wetter regions and rye in some areas. Wheat was more prestigious, less commonly grown at northern latitudes, and bread made from wheat was a luxury marker in ways that seem strange from a modern perspective. Dairy products were important. Milk, butter, skyr, a fermented dairy product similar to thick yogurt, still made in Iceland today. Various cheeses. The Norse kept cattle, goats, and sheep, and managed their dairy output carefully through the seasons. Fresh milk was available in summer and autumn. Preserved dairy, butter packed in bogs, which could last 4 years in the anaerobic conditions of a peat bog, and various aged cheeses, was available through winter. Meat. The Norse ate meat, and ate it with appreciation, but the image of Vikings gorging on vast quantities of roasted flesh at every meal is television, not history. Meat was a periodic rather than daily feature for most households. Animals were valuable. A cow represented significant wealth. A breeding sow was a productive asset. And killing them for food was a calculated decision rather than a casual one. Autumn slaughter, before winter, was the time when animals that couldn't be fed through the winter were killed, preserved, and stored. The resulting salt meat, smoked meat, and dried meat was then rationed through the cold months. Fish was enormously important, particularly in coastal regions. Norway's relationship with fish, cod especially, but also herring, salmon, and many others, is ancient and deep. And in the Viking Age, dried fish and salted fish were both primary food sources and important trade goods. The stockfish industry, producing air-dried cod from the Arctic fishing grounds, was a significant economic activity even in this period. Vegetables. Root vegetables, primarily, because root vegetables can be stored through winter. Turnips, parsnips, onions. Some leafy vegetables in summer. Gathered foods, berries, nuts, wild plants, supplementing the cultivated supply during the warmer months. The vegetable dimension of the Viking diet was limited by the cold climate and the short growing season. Ale. The Viking Age drank ale, not as a luxury or a special occasion indulgence, but as a daily beverage, including with meals, including in the morning, including for children. This was not Viking Age decadence. It was a practical response to the fact that the water supply was frequently unreliable and potentially hazardous, and the fermentation process made ale substantially safer than untreated water. The ale of the period was lower in alcohol than modern beer, denser in calories, and served at room temperature, which is to say cold, because room temperature in a Viking Age longhouse in January is cold. You're going to drink ale with breakfast and lunch, to the extent that lunch is a distinct meal, which it often isn't, and dinner, not because you're recreating an authentic Viking experience, but because the ale is safer than the water, and your body needs the calories, and there are no alternatives. Now let's talk about what the Viking diet means for you specifically. Today, as a modern person suddenly inserted into it, you're probably missing several things that your body has come to consider non-optional. Coffee, if you're a coffee drinker, and the caffeine withdrawal headache that begins 4 to 6 hours after your last cup, is a very real and very specific kind of misery that is going to be sharing your morning with everything else. Coffee doesn't exist in Viking Age Scandinavia. Tea doesn't exist. The closest thing is herbal infusions, various medicinal and culinary herbs brewed in hot water, which are fine in their own right, but contain approximately 0 caffeine and will do nothing for the headache. If you take any regular medication, blood pressure, thyroid, antidepressants, anything, those are gone. The medication doesn't exist. The pharmacy doesn't exist. The diagnosis that led to the prescription doesn't exist. Whatever the medication was managing, it is now being unmanaged, and the timeline for when that becomes a serious problem depends on what it was and how critical it was. If you wear glasses or contacts, also gone. Viking Age. Optometry is not a thing. Whatever your unaided vision is, that's what you have for the day. If you have any food allergies, particularly serious ones, the Viking Age has no ingredient labels, no allergen warnings, no EpiPens. The cook at the hearth is using what she has without knowledge of or particular concern for what your immune system might think about any of it. A serious anaphylactic reaction in the Viking Age has essentially one outcome, and it is not the outcome you want. The morning meal is finished. Bowls are put aside, cleaned in the Viking sense, which means wiped out with bread or a finger, not washed with soap and hot water. The fire is tended, the household is organizing itself for the day. And someone is looking at you with the specific expression of a person who is going to ask you something in Old Norse that requires an answer. Let's talk about that. Chapter 3. The language. You are functionally mute, and that is a serious problem. The person looking at you is the head of the household. You can tell by the way others orient toward him. Subtly, not dramatically, but consistently. He's probably in his 40s, which, in the Viking Age, is genuinely middle-aged rather than just technically middle-aged. He's built in the way that outdoor physical labor builds people, not gym-sculpted, but functionally powerful, with the specific kind of strength that comes from using your body as a working tool every day for decades. He says something to you. Old Norse. Of course it's Old Norse. What else would it be? But the knowledge that it's Old Norse doesn't help you understand it. Old Norse is the ancestor of the modern Scandinavian languages. And if you speak modern Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish, you might catch fragments. Certain words have changed less than others over 1,000 years. But even native speakers of modern Scandinavian languages describe Old Norse as largely incomprehensible without specific study. The grammar is different. The pronunciation is different. The vocabulary has diverged. And crucially, the specific dialect and accent of whatever community you've ended up in adds another layer of variation on top of the baseline difficulty. You don't understand a word of it. He waits. He repeats himself. He's not angry, not yet, just doing what everyone does when not understood, saying the same thing again with more clarity and less speed, as if the problem is volume or pace, rather than the fundamental absence of any shared linguistic framework. You say something, in English, whatever comes naturally. Probably something like, "I'm sorry, I don't understand," or "I don't speak, I'm not from here." And the response on his face is fascinating and alarming simultaneously. He has encountered something that his existing categories don't cover. You're clearly not speaking any language he recognizes. You're clearly not a local. You're clearly not from any of the communities that Norse traders and warriors regularly encountered. You don't sound like an Anglo-Saxon. You don't sound like a Frank. You don't sound like anyone he's heard before. What you sound like to a Viking Age Norse speaker is someone speaking a language that doesn't exist yet, because modern English is, among other things, the product of Old English, itself a Germanic language related to but distinct from Old Norse, the Norman conquest of 1066, and the resulting flood of French vocabulary, the great vowel shift of the 15th century, which completely changed how English vowels were pronounced, several centuries of borrowing from Latin, Greek, and eventually every other language on earth, and a standardization process driven by printing and then mass literacy. The result is a language that is both descended from and completely unrecognizable to its medieval ancestors. He cannot place you. And in a world where being placeable, having an identifiable origin, a recognizable community affiliation, a social category that tells people who you are and therefore how to treat you, is essential to social function, not being placeable is a serious problem. Let's be specific about what you've lost by losing language. You cannot explain yourself. You cannot describe where you're from, how you got here, what you're doing, what you need, what you can offer, or what the extraordinary story of your actual situation is. You cannot ask questions. Where am I? What day is it? Who are you? What's happening today? Where is the nearest town? You cannot express needs. I'm cold. I'm hungry. I need medical attention. I'm allergic to whatever that is. You cannot navigate social situations. I meant no offense. I apologize for the misunderstanding. I'm grateful for your hospitality. Please don't do whatever you're about to do. Communication through gesture is real and partly functional for the most basic things. Pointing, indicating, the universal expressions of hunger and cold and fatigue that every human culture can read. You can signal non-threat through body language, through open hands, and avoiding eye contact in the right measure through the universal posture of someone who means no harm and knows it. Some of this will work, some of the time, but the nuances, the things that really matter in social navigation, gesture cannot carry. The difference between a misunderstanding and a deliberate insult, the difference between a stranger who is safe to help and one who represents a risk, the difference between genuine ignorance of a social rule and deliberate flouting of it. These distinctions matter enormously in Viking Age Norse society, and you cannot communicate any of them. You also cannot communicate competence. In any social environment, the ability to describe your skills and experience and knowledge is fundamental to establishing yourself as someone worth having around. In the Viking Age, where your value to the community is a direct function of what you can contribute, and where failure to contribute has real social and potentially physical consequences, not being able to say, I know how to do X, means that X will go unknown until demonstrated, and demonstration requires opportunity, and opportunity requires trust, and trust requires communication. You're in a circle that has no obvious entry point. Norse society in the Viking Age had a concept, drengskaper, roughly translatable as honorable conduct, the behavioral code of a person who was worth respecting. It encompassed courage, reliability, skill, generosity, loyalty to one's kin and lord. Being known for drengskaper opened social doors. Being unknown, not having a reputation, not being from somewhere, not being connected to anyone, was a neutral baseline at best and a suspicious circumstance at worst. You are worse than unknown. You are incomprehensible. And the Norse, practical people, shaped by a demanding environment, had a limited patience for the incomprehensible before they needed to resolve it into one of the available categories: friend, enemy, tradable asset, liability. Right now, you are hovering between the last two, and the determining factor is going to be what happens next. What happens next is that the household head makes a decision. He says something to a younger person nearby. You don't know what, and the younger person comes toward you and gestures clearly in the direction of the door and the outdoors. The message is unmistakable. Come with me. There is work. You're going to do it. This is actually the best possible outcome of this interaction. You've been assigned. You have a temporary role. The question of who you are and why you're here has been set aside in favor of the more practical question of what you can be made to do today. Whether you can do it is a different question entirely, and we're about to find out. Chapter 4. The work. What a Viking Age day demands from your body. You're outside. The cold has reintroduced itself with the enthusiasm of something that never really left. It was just waiting for you to come back out where it could get at you properly. The young man who gestured you through the door is already moving with purpose toward one of the outbuildings, and you're following him with the specific gait of someone trying to look like they know where they're going while having absolutely no idea where they're going. The farm, because this is a farm, a Norse bu, the fundamental economic unit of Viking Age Scandinavian society, is coming into its morning activity. It's still barely light. The sky has committed to a pale gray that passes for daylight at this latitude in January, providing enough illumination to see by, without anything that could reasonably be called warmth or cheer. There are other people moving between buildings. a woman carrying something toward the main longhouse, an older man examining something on the exterior wall of the byre with the focused attention of someone who has found a problem and is assessing its severity. The farm is not large by modern standards, but it is complete. The main longhouse you slept in, the byre attached to it or nearby, housing the cattle that were too valuable to leave without shelter in winter, a smaller building that might be a storage house, stabber, raised on posts to keep vermin out of, the food supply, possibly a smithy if this is a prosperous enough household to have one, a well, or access to a nearby water source. The whole arrangement sitting in a clearing carved from or adjacent to landscape that is, in January, comprehensively white and comprehensively indifferent to human comfort. The young man, let's call him your handler for the day, the person who has been assigned the task of making you useful, stops at the woodpile, or rather, at the space where the woodpile should be, which is currently occupied by a collection of large, unsplit logs and a substantial iron-headed axe embedded in a chopping block. He points at the logs. He points at the axe. He mimes briefly, and with the exaggerated clarity of someone communicating with a person of uncertain intelligence, the action of splitting wood. He looks at you. The look contains a question and a mild challenge simultaneously. Can you do this thing that I'm not going to explain further because it is self-evident? You nod. Because what else are you going to do? He leaves. You are alone with the logs. Let's talk about splitting wood, because splitting wood with an axe is one of those tasks that looks simple until you try it, and then reveals itself as a skill with real depth that takes time to develop, and that your body, specifically, is not prepared for. The basic mechanics are not complicated. You lift the axe, you bring it down on the log splits. The complications arrive immediately. The weight of a splitting axe, a real one, a Viking Age iron-headed axe of the kind sitting in this chopping block, not a lightweight modern camp hatchet, is significant. Not unmanageable, but significant in a way that becomes very clear after the first few swings, when the muscles in your shoulders and upper back register that they are being asked to do something they have not been trained for, repeatedly, with immediate feedback in the form of the axe bouncing off the log, because you hit it wrong. Hitting it right requires understanding the grain of the wood and where it will split most easily, positioning the log correctly on the chopping block, generating the right arc with the axe so that it comes down with maximum force at the right angle, and following through without flinching. None of this is intuitive on first encounter. All of it is automatic for someone who has been doing it since childhood, which is when Viking Age children started doing it, because Viking Age children did not have a protected developmental period during which they were shielded from useful labor. They worked from ages that would make modern child welfare professionals deeply uncomfortable. They participated in the household's economic activity in ways appropriate to their developing strength and capability. The wood is hardwood. Birch probably, or perhaps oak, depending on what was available. Birch is common in Scandinavia and splits reasonably well. It's also cold, which affects the splitting behavior. Cold wood can be more brittle, which is occasionally an advantage, or it can have ice in the grain, which isn't. You swing, the axe hits the log. The log does not split. The axe bites in and stops, stuck, and extracting it requires an undignified wrestling process that involves levering and twisting, and eventually the log falling off the chopping block and requiring repositioning. You try again. The second swing is better, more committed, better aimed. The log splits partially, a crack running most of the way through. The third swing finishes it. 2 pieces of firewood, produced at a cost of 3 swings, approximately 90 seconds of effort, and the beginning of a warmth in your shoulders that is going to become something considerably less pleasant within the hour. An experienced Norse farm worker splits wood with a rhythm and efficiency that makes it look easy. Single swings, reading the grain instantly, placing each strike with precision, moving through a pile of logs at a pace that generates its own momentum. It is, when done well, almost beautiful. the specific beauty of a person who is very good at a physical task, expressing that competence through economy of motion and accuracy of execution. You're not going to achieve that today. You're going to achieve wood split eventually, at a pace that would make your handler wince if he were watching, at a physical cost that is going to compound with every other demand the day makes on your body. Your hands, which were already dealing with the cold, are now dealing with the vibration transmitted through the axe handle on every swing, and the grip pressure required to control a heavy axe, and the specific abrasion of an axe handle that is not the smooth, treated, ergonomically considered handle of a modern tool, but a piece of shaped wood with its own texture and its own ideas about your palms. Blisters are not immediate, but their foundations are, being laid with every swing. Your lower back is also filing an early complaint. The chopping motion, bending forward with the downswing, straightening through the split, is a repetitive load on the lumbar spine that your back, accustomed to a chair or a car seat or a couch, is not prepared for. It will manage for a while. It will manage for longer than it wants to, actually, because stopping is not an obvious option. Stopping means standing in the cold, doing nothing, which is worse in a different way. You keep splitting. The pile of split wood grows slowly. Your rhythm improves marginally. You settle into something that functions, if not efficiently, at least persistently. And then the next task arrives, because in the Viking Age, the tasks don't wait for you to finish the previous one to complete satisfaction. The farm has multiple urgent needs simultaneously, and the labor available to meet them is limited. And the young man has reappeared with the body language of someone who needs you somewhere else now. Water. The water source, a well or a nearby stream, or a hole maintained in the ice of a frozen pond, needs to be visited multiple times a day. Water for the household, water for the animals, water for cooking. Water doesn't come to you. You go to it with containers, and you carry it back, and then you go again. This is not a task that modern infrastructure has made you appreciate in its full daily weight, because in your life, water appears at the turn of a tap and disappears down a drain, and you never think about either end of that transaction. Here, every liter of water represents a trip to the source and back, in winter weather carrying weight. The containers are wooden or ceramic, heavy before you add the water, heavier after. The path to the water source is whatever the path is, which in January means potentially icy, which means potentially treacherous underfoot, in your completely inappropriate modern footwear. Your shoes, designed for the flat, maintained surfaces of a modern world, have no grip system for ice and packed snow. You are going to slip. The question is not if, but when, and whether the fall is merely undignified or actually injurious. You slip. It is merely undignified. This time, the water is heavy. The walk back is longer than the walk out felt. Your shoulders, already complaining about the axe work, have registered the addition of carrying weight and updated their complaint accordingly. This is 2 tasks. You have been outside for approximately an hour. The day is long. Let's catalog what a full Viking Age working day actually involves for a farm laborer, because I want you to understand the totality of what your body is being asked to do. Animal care, feeding, watering, mucking out. The cattle in the byre produce waste at a steady rate that must be cleared regularly, or the ammonia buildup becomes a health hazard for the animals and everyone else. Mucking out is done with wooden tools into wooden or wicker containers that are then carried out and deposited at a distance from the living areas. It smells exactly as you imagine. It is also paradoxically somewhat warming. The biological activity of decomposing animal waste generates heat, and the byre itself, heated by animal bodies, is warmer than the outside air. Firewood preparation and carrying, ongoing throughout the day, because the central hearth is a continuous consumer of fuel, and running out of fuel on a January night in Scandinavia is a life-threatening situation rather than an inconvenience. Food preparation. In the Viking Age, this is a major time investment. Grain doesn't arrive as flour ready to use. It may need to be ground using a hand quern. 2 heavy circular stones, the upper one rotated by hand to grind grain between them. which is physically demanding and time-consuming. Bread needs to be made. The midday and evening meals need to be prepared. In a household of any size, food preparation is essentially continuous. Textile work. This is primarily but not exclusively women's work in the Norse social division of labor, and it is not a small thing. The Viking Age clothed itself through the production of textiles at the household level, spinning wool into yarn on a drop spindle, weaving on a warp-weighted loom, cutting and sewing garments. The quantity of wool that needed to be processed to keep a household clothed through a Scandinavian winter was substantial, and the work was essentially never finished. There was always more wool to spin, more yarn to weave, more garments to repair. Maintenance of buildings and equipment. The longhouse, the byre, the outbuildings, the tools, the boats if there are boats. All of these require ongoing maintenance that in winter means checking for storm damage, clearing snow loads from roofs before they become structural problems, repairing what broke and preventing what's about to break. And in addition to all of this regular farm labor, there may be craft production. The household might include a smith, a woodworker, a leather worker, someone who produced goods for trade or for sale at the periodic markets that formed the commercial nodes of Viking Age Scandinavia. Every single one of these tasks demands skills you don't have and physical conditioning you haven't developed. Here's the specific physical reality. By midday, your body is going to be in a state that is well outside anything it has experienced before. Not the specific focus soreness of a hard workout, the kind that modern exercise culture has taught you to interpret as a positive sign of effort. This is comprehensive, multi-system fatigue from sustained output across muscle groups that haven't been asked to do this before, in cold that is continuously drawing energy from your core after inadequate sleep on an inadequate sleeping surface, fueled by a breakfast that was calorically sufficient but compositionally unlike anything your digestive system is accustomed to. Your lower back is going to be making its position known loudly by mid-morning. Your hands are going to have progressed from cold and achy to blistered and struggling to close properly. Your shoulders are going to be making the specific complaint of muscles that have done unfamiliar repetitive work, underload. Not sharp pain, but the deep, insistent ache of fiber that has been stressed beyond its current capacity. Your feet are going to be cold in a way that has graduated from uncomfortable to worrying because your footwear is not adequate, and cold feet on a day of continuous outdoor work in January are not just uncomfortable. They are the beginning of a process that, if not reversed, leads to places you don't want to go. And you're going to be hungry again because the porridge of this morning, however warming in the moment, was burned through in a couple of hours of physical work, and the Viking Age does not have a mid-morning snack culture. You work until the meal. The meal comes when the meal comes. The young man, your handler, has been watching your work with an expression that has evolved over the morning from neutral expectation through mild disappointment to a kind of philosophical acceptance. He's adjusted his assessment of what you can do. He's assigning you the tasks at the lower end of the skill and strength requirements, which is both considerate and revealing. He knows what he's working with now. He hands you something to eat around what feels like mid-morning, a piece of flatbread, dense, slightly smoky from being cooked directly on the hearthstones. It is the best thing you have ever eaten. This is not because it is objectively delicious. It is because you are genuinely hungry in the specific attention-consuming way that sustained physical work in the cold produces, and because warmth and calories in those conditions register as something close to joy. You eat it standing up, in the cold, outside, because there is more work to do, and sitting down to eat formally is a different meal. For later, this is your day. This is what Viking Age farm life is. Not the raids, not the mead halls, not the dramatic battles that the sagas record and the television shows dramatize. This, the water carrying, the wood splitting, the animal care, the relentless physical maintenance of a human life in a cold northern landscape. This is what the vast majority of Norse people did every day from childhood to death, and they were good at it, comprehensively, unself-consciously, matter-of-factly good at it, not because they were stronger than you in some essential, inarticulate way, but because they had been doing it since they were old enough to hold a tool, because their bodies had been shaped by it, because the skills were so deeply embedded that they required no conscious thought to execute, because the cold was not an unusual challenge to overcome but simply the background condition of life. You are not good at it, not yet, not today, possibly not ever, if today is all you have. And the day, remember, is not over, not even close. Chapter 5. The Social Minefield. Honor, Hierarchy, and How to Get It Catastrophically Wrong. Let's step back from the physical demands for a moment. Not because they're over, they're very much not over, but because there's a parallel challenge running alongside the physical one that is equally dangerous and considerably more difficult to see coming. The social dimension of Viking Age Norse life. You have been operating in a household for half a day now, and in that half day, you have been the beneficiary of a combination of Norse hospitality culture and the practical decision by the household head that you are more useful doing low-skill labor than you are as a problem to be resolved. This has kept you safe. This has given you structure and proximity to warmth and food. It is a genuinely good position to be in, and you should not take it for granted, because the social world of Viking Age Scandinavia is a minefield, and you are walking through it barefoot, blindfolded, with no map. Let's start with honor, Dringskapper, which we mentioned earlier, and NID, which we need to discuss in detail now. Norse society was an honor culture, not in the loose, modern sense, where honor is a vague positive quality, in the specific, technical, anthropological sense of a society where personal honor was a real, measurable social asset that directly affected your material well-being, your relationships, your legal standing, and your physical safety. Honor could be won, maintained, and lost. Losing it had consequences that went well beyond embarrassment. The concept of NID, dishonor, cowardice, unmanliness, was the specific form of social attack that Norse honor culture had developed for destroying someone's standing. An accusation of need was not merely an insult. It was a legal and social mechanism. A person successfully accused of nide, particularly through the specific forms of ergi, sexual unmanliness, or blodder, softness, cowardice, could lose legal standing, be denied the protections of the community, and was expected to respond violently to the accusation or confirm it by failing to do so. This is a system you are not going to navigate correctly, not because you're a bad person, but because the map of what constitutes honorable versus dishonorable behavior in Norse society is not your map. You were raised on different assumptions. Let's take some specific examples. Eye contact. In modern Western culture, direct eye contact is generally a sign of honesty and engagement. Avoiding eye contact suggests deception or discomfort. In Viking Age, Norse culture, the reading of eye contact was more nuanced and context-dependent. Holding the gaze of a superior for too long could be read as challenge, a refusal to acknowledge their higher status. Dropping your eyes too quickly could read as submission to the point of weakness. Getting this wrong doesn't cause immediate violence, but it contributes to an impression that accumulates. Physical space. The longhouse is a shared space with no private areas, and the navigation of physical proximity, how close you stand to whom, where you sit relative to others, whether you move toward or away from people in various situations, is a continuous social communication that you are probably getting wrong in small ways, repeatedly. Not disastrously wrong, but consistently slightly off in ways that register subconsciously to people whose calibration for these signals is highly refined. Gifts and generosity. Generosity was a core Norse virtue. A chieftain who distributed wealth freely to his followers was a good chieftain. A man who shared his resources with guests and kin was an honorable man. The reciprocal obligation, created by gifts, was real and binding. Accepting a gift created an obligation to return it in kind, eventually in some form. You have nothing to give. You have accepted food and shelter and warmth without reciprocating with anything except some inefficient labor. This debt is accumulating. How the household chooses to view it depends on how they've categorized you. Charity case, potential useful member of the household, mysterious stranger whose story hasn't emerged yet, but it is there. Weapons and their handling. In a culture where free men carried weapons as a matter of identity, how you handle or don't handle weapons says something about you. You don't have weapons. You haven't been given any. This is appropriate given your status as an unclear stranger of unestablished trustworthiness, but your relationship to the weapons around you, the axes on walls, the knives on belts, the equipment that fills the longhouse the way tools fill any working home, communicates something. Nervousness around weapons reads as weakness. Inappropriate familiarity with other people's weapons reads as presumption or threat. The women of the household. Norse women had considerably more legal and social autonomy than women in many contemporary medieval cultures. They could own property, manage households independently when husbands were away on voyages or raids, have their marriages dissolved under certain circumstances, and speak with authority within their domestic sphere. The husfreyja, the lady of the house, had genuine power and genuine respect in the household hierarchy. You need to treat her with exactly the right level of respect, acknowledging her authority without being sycophantic, being appropriately deferential without being patronizing, doing what she asks without making it weird. Modern gender assumptions and modern behavioral defaults around women are not going to serve you perfectly here. Norse gender dynamics were different, not better or worse in every dimension, but different. And navigating them requires understanding you don't have. Now here's the scenario that's most likely to go seriously wrong, and it's coming this afternoon. Mealtime, the main meal of the day, the nattverder, the evening meal, is a social event, as well as a nutritional one. In a Norse household of any significance, the evening meal is where the social hierarchy of the household is displayed and reinforced. Where you sit matters. The high seat, the undvegesuler, the carved pillars flanking the senior seat at the center of the long wall, is for the household head. Guests of honor sit near the senior positions. Lower status members of the household and workers sit further from the center. The order of seating encodes the social order. You don't know where to sit. More specifically, you're going to have to make a decision about where to sit, because someone is going to gesture you toward the table or the boards laid across trestles that function as a table. And the gesture is going to be general enough that interpretation is required, and your interpretation is going to be based on the wrong assumptions. If you sit too high, closer to the household head than your status warrants, you have committed an offense, not a capital one, not an immediate crisis, but a social misstep that will be noticed and logged and will affect how you are treated for the rest of the evening. If you sit too low, placing yourself below people whose status is actually lower than yours would be, if anyone understood what your status was, you signal weakness, which in a culture that reads weakness as confirming of the worst social categories is not where you want to be. The safest position is whatever position seems to be indicated by the most direct, unambiguous social signal from someone who has authority to indicate it. Watch, wait. Don't move until someone makes it. Unclear where you're supposed to be. This is slow and obvious and slightly awkward, but it is less dangerous than guessing. The food at the evening meal is better than breakfast. More varied, more prepared, reflecting the Norse relationship with the evening meal as a social occasion rather than a quick fueling stop. There will be meat, probably, if the household has it. There will be bread. There will be ale, more than at breakfast. There may be something sweet. Honey mead, perhaps, if this is a prosperous household or a special occasion. Or simply the ale that has been the baseline beverage of the day. Eating customs matter too. You eat what you're given. You don't make faces at the food or perform reactions that suggest it's not meeting your expectations, because the food you're being given represents real resources from a household that carefully manages its stores through a long winter. Expressing dissatisfaction with it is an insult to the husfreyja who prepared it and to the household head who provides it. You eat with a knife, your own knife, which you don't have. Someone may lend you one. The Norse did not eat with forks. They used a knife and fingers and spoon for liquid dishes. Watching what the people around you do and mirroring it is your best strategy. Not perfectly, not immediately, but approximately and with genuine attention. Now, the drinking. Ale was consumed at meals and socially in ways that were governed by specific customs. Toasts, skål, the word that becomes the modern Scandinavian skål, were a social ritual with specific protocols. The wrong response to a toast, or the failure to participate in one correctly, was a social misstep. Drinking too much and behaving badly was, in a warrior culture with specific codes around self-control and dignity, a mark against you. Drinking too little, or refusing to drink, raised questions about why. And here's the specific nightmare scenario. Someone makes a toast or a boast. The Norse bragarfull, the toast over the ceremonial cup at which men made vows, was a real institution, and the attention turns to you, not necessarily demanding a formal vow, but expecting some kind of participation, some acknowledgement of the social ritual. And you cannot participate, not properly, not in a way that doesn't mark you as either disrespectful or incomprehensible. You smile. You raise whatever vessel you have. You drink when others drink. You make the sounds of appreciation and participation without any of the content. It is a performance of social membership by someone who is not a member. And it may work well enough for tonight, in a household that has decided to give you the benefit of a doubt that your behavior keeps testing. But the evening meal has one more danger, and it's the most Norse of all the dangers. The stories. Viking Age. Norse culture was a culture of story and performance. The long winter evenings in the longhouse were filled with the recitation of poems, the telling of sagas, the performance of the oral tradition that would eventually, centuries later, be written down as the literature we now study. Skalds, court poets, were prestigious figures in Norse society, and the ability to compose and recite poetry was valued in a way that has no direct modern equivalent. At a certain point in the evening, it's possible, likely even in a household of any cultural ambition, that someone will perform a poem, a story, a recitation of something that the household knows and values and is pleased to hear again. The rest of the household will listen with the specific quality of attention that people give to things they know are important, and they will respond at the right moments, and they will be fully present in a way that people in the modern world are rarely fully present for a single thing. And you will have no idea what any of it means, but here's what you can do. Listen. Really listen. Not to the words, you can't have those, but to the music of the language, the cadence of the verse, the way the performer's voice moves through the piece. Watch the faces of the people listening. Let the experience of being in a room where something culturally significant is happening wash over you without the requirement of fully understanding it. This is not nothing. This is actually something remarkable. To be in a room with the oral tradition of a culture that most of the world knows only as legend, performed by someone for whom it is living reality, surrounded by people for whom these stories are as familiar and meaningful as the most important stories of your own culture. You can't translate it, but you can receive it. And if you can manage to look like you're receiving it genuinely, with attention, and without the glazed expression of someone who has checked out, then you will have done tonight the most socially successful thing available to you. Chapter 6. The medical reality. What happens when your body fails? By late afternoon, something specific has happened to your right hand, the blister that was forming this morning, the one on the palm, at the base of the middle and ring fingers, where the axe handle made its most sustained contact with your skin, has progressed through its development cycle faster than expected, because you kept working after it formed, because stopping wasn't an option you could easily exercise, because nobody around you has any particular reason to notice or manage your blister situation. It's broken now. The skin has torn, leaving a raw, wet, openly complaining wound in one of the highest friction locations on your hand. Every grip you take, on the axe, on the water containers, on anything, presses directly on it. It is not objectively a serious injury. By any modern medical standard, it is a minor inconvenience requiring a bandage and perhaps some antiseptic cream and a day of lighter duty. In the Viking Age, it is a minor inconvenience that is going to fester if not managed, and managed here means something very different from what you're used to. Let's talk about Viking Age medicine, because you need to understand the system you're operating in. The Norse had medicine, real medicine, a body of practical knowledge about treating injuries and illness that had been accumulated through generations of practical experience in a physically demanding environment. The Lekning Akona, the healing woman, was a recognized figure in Norse society, possessed of botanical and practical medical knowledge that was genuinely effective for a range of conditions. The Norse sagas contain medical accounts, descriptions of battlefield injuries and their treatment, that suggest a sophisticated practical understanding of wound care, fracture management, and surgical intervention. Some of what they knew was genuinely good. Honey was used for wound treatment, and honey has real antibacterial properties. Modern medicine has rediscovered honey-based wound dressings because they work. Certain herbs with genuine pharmacological properties were in common use. The practice of keeping wounds clean, not in the germ theory sense, but in the practical sense of removing visible contamination, was standard. The Norse sagas describe a battlefield triage method involving feeding suspected internal injury patients onion soup and then smelling the wound to see if the onion smell emerged, a crude but real test for intestinal perforation. But here's the fundamental, inescapable structuring fact of Viking Age medicine. The germ theory of disease doesn't exist. Nobody knows about bacteria. Nobody knows about viruses. Nobody understands the mechanism by which infection occurs, or what the relationship is between contamination of a wound and the subsequent fever and swelling and potential death. They know that certain wounds go bad and certain wounds don't, and they have practical heuristics. Keep it clean, apply honey, use certain herbs that work better than nothing. But they have no antibiotics. They have no antiseptics in the modern sense. They have no understanding of why any of their treatments work or don't work. Your blister, untreated in a working environment, is going to get infected. Probably. Not certainly. The body has its own defenses, and healthy people fight off minor infections regularly. But probably. And an infected blister in an environment without antibiotics follows a track that modern people have entirely forgotten is possible. Local infection, potentially spreading infection, potentially systemic infection, potentially life-threatening infection. Not from a blister, you might think, but yes, from a blister if the wrong bacteria get in and the body's defenses are compromised by cold, exhaustion, and nutritional stress, all of which you're currently experiencing. This is the background, medical reality of the Viking Age. Every wound, every infection, every illness exists in a world where the escalation path from minor to fatal is shorter and less predictable than anything you've been conditioned to expect. Let's talk about the specific medical landscape you're inhabiting today. Your feet. We mentioned the inadequacy of your footwear, and now we need to revisit it specifically in medical terms. Cold, wet feet that have been cold and wet for an extended period develop a condition called non-freezing cold injury, colloquially trench foot or immersion foot. The tissue damage begins before frostbite, at temperatures above freezing, through sustained constriction of blood flow to the feet in response to cold. Symptoms begin with numbness, which you may be experiencing right now and interpreting as simply cold feet. Progress to swelling, redness, and pain as circulation is restored, and can advance to blistering tissue death, and in serious cases, permanent nerve damage or worse. The Norse solution to this is wear the right footwear. Specifically, the leather shoes, skor, that Norse people wore were often stuffed with insulating material, wool, dried grass, moss, and were shaped to accommodate layers of wool wrapping around the feet. They were not waterproof in any absolute sense, but leather that has been treated with fat is highly water resistant, and the combination of fat-treated leather and wool wrapping maintained foot temperature substantially better than what you're wearing. You are wearing the wrong footwear. You have been wearing it all day. Your feet have been telling you about this in increasingly specific terms since mid-morning, and you have been overriding the information because you have no alternative. By evening, your feet are going to be a genuine medical concern. Now let's talk about something that hasn't happened yet, but might, and that you need to understand in the context of Viking Age medicine. Teeth. We covered dental health in the Middle Ages, chapter of the previous script, but the Viking Age version has its own character. Norse dental health was actually somewhat better than later medieval periods in some respects. The Viking Age diet, while high in coarse grains that cause mechanical wear, was lower in refined sugars than later periods. But dental caries existed, dental abscesses existed, and in a culture of people who used their teeth as a third hand, biting rope, holding materials, cracking things open, dental injuries were not uncommon. If you have an existing dental problem, a filling that might fail, a crown that might come loose, anything that's been managed by modern dentistry and is being sustained by that management. The Viking Age is an unforgiving place for it to become unmanaged. The treatment for a bad tooth was endure it, apply various herbal remedies that might reduce the pain somewhat, or have it extracted, extraction without, anesthesia, by someone who may or may not have done it before, with tools that were not designed specifically for the purpose, in conditions with no sterile technique. You don't want to need a tooth extracted today. The headache that arrived this morning, the one you've been managing by ignoring it because there's no alternative, is the caffeine withdrawal headache. It's real, it's significant, and it's going to be with you for the next several days as your nervous system adjusts to the absence of a substance it has come to consider mandatory for basic functioning. There is nothing in the Viking Age pharmacopoeia that addresses caffeine withdrawal specifically. Willow bark tea, which contains salicin, metabolized into salicylic acid in the body, essentially aspirin, might take the edge off the headache's worst moments. Whether the household has willow bark and whether anyone is going to recognize your headache as something to treat depends on circumstances. You can't control. Drink the ale. This is not advice I give lightly, but in this context, the mild sedative and analgesic effects of alcohol, combined with the caloric contribution, make the ale a genuinely useful medical intervention for your current collection of complaints. Not in large quantities. Being impaired in the Viking Age is a vulnerability you can't afford, but steadily, as the evening progresses, in the social context of the meal and the household gathering. Now let's talk about the illness scenario, because one of the ways today might go wrong isn't through injury. It's through your immune system encountering a pathogen load it wasn't prepared for. The longhouse is, from an epidemiological standpoint, a petri dish. Many people in close quarters, with animals, in conditions that don't include modern sanitation, breathing shared air around a fire that doesn't fully ventilate. The pathogens that circulate in this environment are not necessarily more dangerous than modern pathogens, but they're ones your immune system hasn't encountered in the specific strains present here, because immunity is specific, and the microbial world of the Viking Age is different from the one you grew up in. Most likely you'll be fine for a single day. The incubation period for most infections is longer than a day, but the seeds may be planted. There's one more medical reality to cover, and it's the most dramatic: violence. The Viking Age was a violent society in the specific technical way we discussed in the Longship chapter. Not uniquely or unusually cruel, but one in which violence was closer to the surface of daily life, more immediately available as a conflict resolution mechanism, and less effectively deterred by institutional structures than the modern world. We are going to talk about this in detail in the next chapter, but the medical dimension of Viking Age violence, deserves a moment here, because the treatment of traumatic injuries is a place where Viking Age medicine was both more sophisticated and more brutal than you might expect. Battlefield surgery, the cleaning and closing of wounds, the management of fractures, the removal of embedded weapons, was practiced and had its own techniques and practitioners. The sagas describe surgeries that were genuinely remarkable for their era, but they were performed without anesthesia, without sterile technique. In any modern sense, without the pharmacological support that makes modern surgery survivable beyond the immediate intervention. If you receive a significant injury today, a bad fall, a cut from an axe or knife, any of the various ways that a physically demanding environment can damage a human body, the treatment available is painful, imprecise, and dependent on factors outside your control. The best medical advice for today is, don't get hurt. This sounds obvious. It is, in fact, the correct answer. Avoid the situations that produce injuries. Stay away from the activities you don't know how to do safely. Don't handle the equipment that requires expertise. Don't try to demonstrate competence you don't have in contexts where the failure mode is physical injury. Your body is your only asset today. It arrived here intact and at full capacity, or close to it. Everything the day has thrown at it has been degrading that capacity in small increments. The cumulative state you're in by late afternoon is blistered hands, aching back, cold feet of medical concern, a headache, mild dehydration, general muscular fatigue, and the early stages of what might be a cold from the smoke inhalation and the cold exposure. None of these individually are disabling. Together they represent a system that is running below capacity in multiple dimensions, simultaneously, and a system running below capacity is a system that makes mistakes. Mistakes in the Viking Age have higher consequences than mistakes in the modern world. That's the thread that runs through all of this. Not that any single thing is necessarily catastrophic, but that the margin for error is thinner, the safety nets are fewer, and the gap between a manageable problem and an unmanageable one is shorter than anything you've been calibrated to expect. Evening is coming. The sky outside the longhouse, what little of it you can see, has shifted from gray to the early dark of a Scandinavian January evening, which arrives with comprehensive decisiveness sometime in mid-afternoon and is simply completely dark by 5 o'clock. The fire inside is the whole world now. And in the firelight, with the household gathering for the evening meal and the social challenges of the night still ahead, you are about to face the final, and in some ways, the most important test of your day. Not physical, not medical. Something older and more fundamental. Whether you belong here, whether you can make yourself for one evening, in one longhouse, in one January in the Viking Age, into something that resembles a person who fits, you almost certainly can't, but you're going to try. Chapter 7. The violence, raids, feuds, and the specific danger of being nobody. The evening meal is over. You managed it. Imperfectly, with the specific awkwardness of someone performing a role they don't fully understand in a language they don't speak, but you managed it. You sat where you were indicated to sit. You ate what was put in front of you. You drank the ale at the right moments and made the right approximations of social participation when the attention of the room moved in your direction. Nobody threw you out. Nobody drew a weapon. By the standards of the day you've had, this counts as a significant success. And now the household is in its evening configuration. The fire banked down slightly, but still burning. The light low and orange and flickering. People distributed around the space in the various postures of after-dinner relaxation. Some are working. The textile production doesn't stop just because the main meal is done. Some are talking in the low, unhurried way of people who have been in each other's company all day and are now simply existing near each other rather than actively communicating. Someone has produced a wooden board game. Hnefatafl, the Norse strategy game that preceded chess as the intellectual game of the Scandinavian world. And two men are playing with the focused, silent concentration of a serious match. It should feel comfortable. It almost does feel comfortable in the firelit warmth of the longhouse after a cold and demanding day. There is something deeply human about this scene. the gathered household, the fire, the low conversation, the shared space at the end of a shared day. That transcends the 1,000-year gap between your world and theirs. And then the door opens. 3 men come in from the cold, not from the household. Visitors arriving in the evening, which is not unusual. Guests were expected to be received, fed, given shelter. The Norse hospitality code was real and binding and was taken seriously, but guests were also assessed the moment they came through the door, with the rapid, practiced social evaluation of a culture that needed to place people quickly and accurately. These 3 men are armed in ways that go beyond the everyday carry of a Norse farmer. They have the specific bearing of men who spend a significant portion of their time doing something more dangerous than agriculture, and the household head's response to their arrival: welcoming but watchful. The specific calibration of a man who is being hospitable because hospitality requires it, and careful because care requires it, tells you that these visitors represent a category of social encounter that is different from ordinary guests. They might be warriors in the service of a local chieftain. They might be traders with a harder edge than average. They might be the advance of a raiding party doing reconnaissance. They might be entirely peaceful men who simply look like trouble because they're large, armed, and unannounced. The Viking Age contained all of these possibilities, and the visual difference between them was not always clear. What is clear is that you, the unknown stranger of inexplicable origin and no established social position, have just become significantly more complicated as a presence in this room, because the new arrivals are looking at you. Not aggressively, not yet, not immediately, but with the specific quality of attention that experienced men in dangerous professions give to things they haven't assessed yet. You are an unassessed variable in their reading of this room, and unassessed variables are, in their world, things to be resolved. Let's use this moment, while the social situation develops in the background, and we have a few minutes before it requires your participation, to talk about violence in the Viking Age, in the comprehensive way it deserves. The Norse were a warrior culture. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It was structurally, legally, and philosophically true in ways that shaped every dimension of social life. Free Norse men had not just the right, but in some contexts, the obligation to bear arms and use them. The ability to fight was not a specialized skill possessed by a professional class. It was a general male competency expected of every free man as a condition of his full social participation. The legal framework reflected this. Norse law, and the Norse were prolific lawmakers, the Thing system being one of the most developed legal institutions of the early medieval world, had a sophisticated structure for managing violence rather than simply prohibiting it. Certain killings were legal, killings in defense of honor, killings carried out openly and announced rather than hidden, killings in the context of formally declared feuds conducted according to specific protocols. The distinction between vig, a legal killing, and mord, murder, an illegal killing, was not about the act of killing itself, but about the social and procedural context in which it occurred. This is genuinely different from modern legal frameworks, where the category of legally sanctioned private killing is essentially non-existent. In the Viking Age, a man who killed another man in response to a serious insult or injury, who announced the killing openly, who paid the appropriate vergild, the compensation payment to the victim's family, had not committed a crime. He had, in the eyes of the law and his community, discharged an obligation. The feud, vigsala, the cycle of killings and counter-killings between families following an initial offense, was a recognized institution, not celebrated exactly, but understood as a real and legitimate social mechanism. The sagas are full of feuds, some running for generations, consuming households, and entire family networks in cycles of retaliation that everyone involved recognized as destructive, and that nobody seemed able to stop because the logic of honor demanded each response. The chieftain system interacted with this in complicated ways. A powerful chieftain, a jarl, or a prominent hersire could sometimes arbitrate between feuding parties, offer settlements, impose peace. But the chieftain's authority was not absolute in the way that a medieval king's was even nominally supposed to be. It rested on personal reputation, the loyalty of armed followers, the ability to deliver results that satisfied the people who followed him. A chieftain who tried to impose a settlement that the parties found deeply unsatisfactory risked losing followers who felt their honor had been traded away. You are in a room where this system is fully operational. The three visitors are now seated, being served ale by a member of the household. The conversation between them and the household head has the surface texture of ordinary social exchange. Questions about the road, the weather, news from wherever they've come from. But underneath it, you can see, even without understanding the words, the specific choreography of men negotiating status in real time, who defers to whom, who holds whose gaze, who says something that makes the others recalibrate slightly. This is happening continuously, automatically, as natural as breathing to people who have grown up in this system. One of the visitors says something. The household head responds, and then both of them look at you. The visitor who spoke is asking about you. Obviously, the question is probably some version of, who is this person? Where are they from? What are they doing here? The household head is answering, and whatever he says is brief, and you can read this from the body language, slightly uncomfortable, because the honest answer is, I don't entirely know. They showed up. They can't speak. I've put them to work. This is not an answer that places you in a recognized social category, and the visitor's expression as he processes it reflects that. Here is the specific danger of being socially unplaceable in the Viking Age, stated as plainly as possible. In a society structured around networks of obligation, loyalty, and kinship, a person outside those networks has no automatic protection. The laws that governed behavior between Norse free men, the prohibitions on illegal killing, the compensation systems, the feud protocols applied to people within the social network. A person without kin, without a lord, without a community that would take action on their behalf if they were harmed, was in a fundamentally vulnerable position. Not necessarily targeted, not necessarily in immediate danger at any given moment, but structurally exposed in a way that a well-connected person was not. The visitor finishes his assessment of you and turns back to the household head. Whatever conclusion he's reached, you're not worth the trouble. You're an interesting mystery. You're a potential asset or liability to be considered. You can't tell from his expression, which has resolved into the neutral, watchful face of a man who has filed the information and moved on. For now, let's talk about rating, because we'd be dishonest not to, and because the rating dimension of the Viking Age is relevant to your day in ways that go beyond the obvious. Viking raids, the organized, violent expeditions against coastal and river-accessible communities that define the Viking Age in popular imagination, were real, substantial, and genuinely terrifying to their targets. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 is the traditional starting point, but by the time of your day, let's say 900 CE, raiding had been going on for over a century, and the communities of Britain, Ireland, France, and much of coastal Europe had developed a relationship with the possibility of Norse raids that combined practical defensive measures with the kind of chronic low-level dread that comes from knowing the threat is real and unpredictable. But raiding was not the only or even the primary activity of most Norse people most of the time. The overwhelming majority of the Norse population were farmers who never went on a raid in their lives. The raiding parties were real, but they were a subset, often young men, often in the years before they'd established farms and families, often motivated by the combination of economic opportunity, social prestige, and the straightforward appeal of adventure that drives young people toward risk in every culture and every era. The community you're in tonight has a relationship with raiding. Some of the men here may have gone, some may be planning to go in the coming sailing season. Some may have family members who went and came back wealthy, or didn't come back at all. The tools and weapons that are visible around the longhouse are not purely agricultural. The specific way the visitors who arrived tonight carry themselves is the bearing of men for whom organized violence is not an abstract concept. And here's where your day intersects with this reality in the most immediate way. Tomorrow, which you may or may not survive to see, but let's think about it, is the beginning of the planning cycle for the summer raiding season. The long winter evenings in the longhouse, the visits of armed men, the conversations that you can't follow but can see have a purposeful quality. These are part of the social and logistical infrastructure of an expedition that will coalesce in spring when the sailing season opens. You are adjacent to this planning. You are in the room where it's happening. And your undefined status means you could be conscripted into it, not voluntarily, not with your informed consent, but simply because you're there and you're male and you have no recognized social position that would exclude you from it and no patron powerful enough to protect you from it if someone decides you're useful for it. The concept of slavery, thraldom, in the Viking Age was real and significant. Norse society had a substantial enslaved population, acquired primarily through raiding. Thrallar, slaves, did agricultural labor, domestic work, and various craft production, and they had essentially no legal rights and no path to social participation. They were property in the legal sense, with all that implies. You are not going to be enslaved tonight. In the household you're in, under the provisional protection of the hospitality code, that's not an immediate scenario. But it's worth understanding that the category exists and that your unclear status places you closer to it than to the full social participation of a free Norse man, simply by virtue of having no established identity. The evening is deepening. The visitors are being settled for the night. More. Sleeping bodies on the benches, the longhouse's population growing by 3, the social temperature shifting with the addition of unknown quantities. You are positioning yourself at the edge of the main gathering, close enough to the fire to benefit from its warmth, far enough from the center of things that you're not requiring attention. This is the right strategy. Keep the profile low. Be present but not demanding. Be warm but not invisible. Complete invisibility in a Norse household is its own kind of suspicious. Find the specific social expression of, I am here, I mean no trouble. I will be useful tomorrow. Please continue to include me in the category of things that don't need to be resolved tonight. You're managing it, barely. The ale is helping. In the moderate quantity you're consuming it, the warmth of the fire is helping. The simple animal fact of being sheltered and fed after a hard day is helping. And then one of the visitors stands up. He's not aggressive. He's not threatening. He's simply moving across the room with a purpose that becomes clear when he stops in front of you and speaks directly to you, looking at you with the clear expectation of a response. You don't know what he said. You never know what anyone says. The silence after his words is the specific silence of a social beat that has not been filled correctly. The moment after a question where the answer should be, but isn't. He waits. The room is aware. In the low-key way, the room is always aware of everything, that something is happening. You meet his eyes, not challengingly, not submissively, but with the steady, open expression of someone who genuinely cannot answer and is not pretending otherwise. You spread your hands in the universal gesture of incomprehension, combined with something that you hope reads as regret rather than indifference. He studies you for a moment. Then he says something shorter. Not a repetition, a different thing. Possibly a simpler version of the question, possibly a completely different question. You still don't understand it. You do the same gesture again. He makes a sound, not hostile, more like a man resolving an ambiguity into a conclusion, and says something to the household head, who responds briefly. The visitor nods and goes back to his seat. You exhale. You don't know what just happened. You don't know what was asked, what was answered on your behalf, what conclusion was reached. But the temperature of the room did not change for the worse, which is the best available evidence that whatever just happened didn't go badly. That's all you can know, that it didn't go badly. In the Viking Age, that's sometimes enough. Chapter 8. The Night. Darkness, dreams, and surviving until morning. The fire is low, not out, never quite out, because someone is always responsible for the fire, and the fire is never allowed to die completely. Not in January, not in a Norse longhouse, where the fire is simultaneously the heating system, the cooking system, and the symbolic center of household life, but low enough that the light has contracted to an orange glow, intimate and insufficient, casting just enough light to see shapes rather than details. The household is asleep. Or rather, the household is in its sleeping configuration. Most people have moved to the sleeping benches, arranged under furs and wool blankets in the specific geometry of people who have slept in this space many times and know exactly where their body fits in relation to everyone else's. The three visitors are slotted into the spaces available, their presence changing the density of the sleeping arrangement without disrupting its fundamental logic. You are lying on the bench you slept on last night, under the same furs, with your back to the room in the instinctive posture of a person who wants to minimize their social footprint, even in sleep. The smoke is present at a lower level now. With fewer people active and the fire quieter, the atmosphere of the longhouse is closer to merely unpleasant rather than actively eye-watering. Your respiratory system, which has been registering complaints all day, has reached a kind of exhausted accommodation. Your body is giving you the full report of the day. The hands, worse. The broken blister is definitely inflamed. The skin around it has the warm, tight quality of beginning infection. And every time you flex your fingers, the specific complaint is loud and specific and not improving. You've wrapped it in a strip of cloth that someone provided without ceremony, which is better than nothing and not as good as proper medical care. The back has moved from complaint to formal grievance. The specific muscles of the lumbar region that bore most of the morning's axe work and water carrying have stiffened during the evening's relative inactivity, and the sleeping surface, a wooden bench covered with straw and a fur, which is comfortable by Viking Age standards and extraordinary by modern ones, is not providing the spinal support that your body, shaped by decades of modern furniture, has come to consider non-negotiable. The feet, cold as discussed. You've removed your shoes, the impulse of a modern person who takes their shoes off when they get into bed, which was probably a mistake because the floor level is colder than the bench level, and now your feet are in direct contact with the cold air, rather than insulated by even inadequate footwear. You should put the shoes back on. The logic is clear. Doing it requires moving, and moving means disturbing the thermal equilibrium you've achieved under the furs. And the thermal equilibrium is the primary comfort available to you right now. So you're going to resolve this conflict by not resolving it and hoping your feet manage. They won't manage as well as you're hoping. The headache, still there. Lower than the afternoon peak, because the ale has taken the edge off it, and the transition from vertical activity to horizontal rest has reduced the pounding quality, but present a background condition like the smoke that you're not going to escape tonight. Now let's talk about sleep itself, because the Viking Age has opinions about sleep that are going to affect you. Sleep in pre-industrial societies was not the consolidated single 8-hour block that modern sleep medicine prescribes and modern schedules enforce. The research of historian A. Roger E. Kirch, documented in his book At Day's Close, established that pre-industrial Europeans commonly slept in two distinct phases, separated by an hour or two of wakefulness in the middle of the night. This first sleep and second sleep pattern is documented in historical sources across many cultures and appears to be the natural human sleep pattern in the absence of artificial light, which compressed and standardized sleep into the single block format we consider normal. In a Viking Age longhouse, this means the night is not quiet. At some point, let's say somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, roughly, the household begins to stir. Not dramatically, not with purpose initially, just the low-level movement of people transitioning from first sleep to the waking interval. Some will tend the fire. This is one of the practical functions of the waking interval, checking and feeding the hearth. Some will pray. The Norse religious practice of the period included nighttime observances. Some will talk quietly, in the specific intimacy of the dark middle hours. Some will do light tasks, mending, thinking, the mental processing that this natural waking interval seems to facilitate. You, who are used to sleeping straight through, are going to find this deeply disorienting. You'll be woken by the movement and the sound at the point when you're finally achieving real sleep after hours of cold and discomfort, and the interruption is going to feel like a violation of the sleep contract. It's not. It's normal, but normal for them is not normal for you, and the distinction is going to cost you the second half of your night's rest. The temperature drops in the longhouse during the deep night hours. The fire, however carefully tended, produces less heat when it's lower, and the cold that is continuously pressing against the walls and roof finds more purchase in the quiet, still air of the middle of the night. Under the furs, you're managing, but the furs are not infinite, and the body heat you generate is doing finite work against an infinite cold, and by the time the night reaches its deepest point, you are in the specific condition of someone who is technically warm enough not to be in immediate danger, but not warm enough to sleep well. Let's talk about the night outside the longhouse, because it matters. The Viking Age night was not safe in ways that the modern world has almost entirely eliminated. Wolves, real wolves, not metaphorical ones, were present throughout Scandinavia, and in winter, when their prey was scarce and hunger made them bolder, they came closer to human settlements. The livestock in the byre represented a significant temptation, and the sounds from outside the longhouse in the deep winter night, the movement of animals, a sound from the darkness that might be the wind or might be something else, were not background noise to be ignored. They were information to be assessed. The night watch. Someone was awake, somewhere in or near the longhouse, with the responsibility of watching for threats through the night. This was not a formal military posting. It was a household function, rotated among the able-bodied members of the household. The duty of staying alert while others slept, so that the sleeping others could sleep safely. The person on watch tonight is not you. You haven't earned that trust, and you lack the skills to execute it usefully. But they're there, somewhere near the door, maintaining the minimal wakefulness that keeps the household from being surprised in the dark. What kind of threats warranted a night watch in the Viking Age? Wolves, as mentioned. Fire, the primary catastrophic risk of a wooden, thatch-roofed structure with a central hearth burning continuously, and the reason that damping and managing the fire through the night was taken so seriously. Weather, a sudden storm loading the roof with snow beyond its structural tolerance, or a wind shift that changed the fire's draw and began smoking out the interior. And people, the possibility of a raid, not just by Norse raiders, but by the various other groups of armed men who moved through the landscape, any of whom might decide that a farmstead represented an opportunity. The concept of night raid, not farin, attacking in the darkness when defenders were asleep, was known and discussed in Norse law, and it was distinguished from the honorable, open confrontation that Norse warrior culture valued. A night raid was cowardly, dishonorable, nidingsverk, a villainous act. This moral condemnation didn't prevent it from happening. It just meant it happened with social disapproval attached, which was cold comfort if you were the farmstead being raided. You are lying in the dark in a building that has somewhere in the back of its collective awareness this possibility as a real and present concern. The night deepens. The household settles into its strange, pre-industrial rhythm. First sleep, the waking interval with its quiet movements and low conversations and fire tending. Then second sleep, which for most of the household runs until dawn. You don't sleep well through any of it. Your body is too depleted and too uncomfortable to achieve the deep, restorative sleep it needs. You drift in and out, genuinely asleep for stretches of 20 or 30 minutes, then surfacing into a cold, smoke-scented, animal-noisy wakefulness, then drifting again. It's not nothing. The body extracts what rest it can from the intervals of genuine sleep, but it's not enough. At some point in the deepest part of the night, you are fully awake, and the longhouse around you is as quiet as it gets, the household in its second sleep. The fire, a low pulse of orange, the sound of the wind outside the only significant noise. And in this quiet you think about what the day has been. The cold and the work and the smoke and the social navigation and the food and the ale and the visitors and the language and the fire and all the thousand specific ways that this world has pressed against you and tested you and found you wanting. You think about the gap between what this world requires and what you are, not as a judgment, not as an indictment of your character or your intelligence or your fundamental human worth, but as a simple, clear-eyed recognition of the mismatch. These people belong here, not in a romantic, destined sense. They didn't choose this world any more than you chose yours, but they were made by it. Every system in them, physical, cognitive, social, emotional, was calibrated by this environment over years and generations until the fit was nearly perfect. The cold that is wearing you down is to them simply January. The work that has exhausted you is to them simply Tuesday. The social codes that you are stumbling through blindly are to them as automatic as breathing. You are not made by this world. You are made by a different one, which produced different things in you, different knowledge, different skills, different assumptions about how reality works. Those things are not useless. They are, in your world, assets. Here tonight, they are mostly irrelevant. This is the deepest truth of what we've been exploring all day. Not that the Viking Age was uniquely horrible, or that modern life is uniquely comfortable, though both things are true in their ways, but that human beings are fundamentally shaped by their environments in ways that run so deep they're invisible from inside, and that being extracted from your environment and placed in another one reveals, with brutal clarity, how much of what you consider yourself is actually a product of where and when you grew up. The Vikings who raided Lindisfarne were not braver than you in some essential, immutable way. They were people for whom the specific combination of skills and courage and tolerance for cold and violence that the raid required had been built into them by a life that demanded those things continuously. If you had grown up in their world, if you had pulled nets at 6 and handled animals at 8 and carried weapons at 12 and gone on your first voyage at 15, you would be as capable as they were. But you didn't, and you're not. Dawn is coming. You can tell before you can see it. A quality of the darkness shifts, less absolute. The black becoming charcoal. The shapes in the longhouse resolving from invisible to shadowy to merely dim. The household's rhythms anticipated. Someone stirs at the fire before the light comes. The animals begin their morning sounds. A child somewhere makes the transition from sleep to wakeful crying that every parent in every era recognizes and responds to. The day is beginning again. You've survived the night. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, significant. The specific hard-won significance of having made it through something that wasn't designed for you, in a world that wasn't built for you, using resources that were inadequate to the task, but that you marshaled as best you could. Your hands are worse this morning than they were last night. Your back has taken the opportunity of the stationary hours to become a more comprehensive problem. Your feet are cold in a specific worrying way that is going to require attention. You are hungry in the deep, functional way of a body that has spent more energy than it has been given. But you're here, still breathing the smoky air of the Viking Age longhouse, still wrapped in the furs that someone was kind enough not to take back, still adjacent to the fire that someone maintained through the night, so that the household would have warmth to wake up to. Let's have one more moment before we bring this to its conclusion. One more thing I want you to understand about the people you've been observing for the last day. They were not a simple people. The popular imagination tends toward simplicity in both directions. Either they were noble savages, free and vital in ways that civilization has corrupted, or they were brutal barbarians, violent and primitive in ways that progress has left behind. Neither of these is true, and both of them are a kind of condescension, the reduction of complex human beings into symbols for whatever argument we want to make about ourselves. The Norse of the Viking Age were people of profound contradiction. They were capable of extraordinary violence and extraordinary art simultaneously. The same culture that produced the Lindisfarne raid produced the Oseberg ship burial, one of the most beautiful objects of the medieval world. They were explorers of genuine daring who reached North America centuries before Columbus, and they were slave traders who built part of their economy on the systematic brutalization of other human beings. They had a legal system of remarkable sophistication and a rating culture of genuine destructiveness. They told stories, the sagas, the Eddas, that are among the great literary achievements of the medieval world, and they told them in winter longhouses around fires like the one you've been sitting beside for the last day. They were fully human, that's the thing, not symbols, not types, not the cast of a television drama. Fully, completely, complexly human, with all the contradiction and capacity and failure and beauty that full humanity entails. And for one day, you were in their world, not as an equal. You were never an equal. You were a stumbling, cold, speechless, blister-handed intruder from a future they couldn't have imagined. But you were there. You felt what cold really means when it's not a temporary inconvenience, but the background condition of life. You felt what physical work really means when it's not exercise you choose for well-being, but survival labor you do, because stopping is not an option. You sat in the firelight and heard the language being spoken and watched the social codes being enacted, and were, for one day, as close to the Viking Age as anyone from your world is ever going to get. That's remarkable. Even when it's terrible, especially when it's terrible, it's remarkable. Chapter 9. The Thing, Norse law, justice, and the day the community decides what to do with you. You didn't see it coming. None of today's challenges announce themselves in advance. The cold didn't send a warning. The work didn't introduce itself politely before destroying your hands. The social minefield didn't provide a map. But this one is the least expected of all, because it arrives in the form of something that looks from the outside like a community gathering. People moving toward a central location with the purposeful ease of people who know where they're going and why. Voices in the morning air carrying that specific quality of civic occasion. Not the urgency of crisis, not the ease of casual socializing, but something in between, formal, structured, important. It is a thing, or rather a local version of one. Not the great Althing of Iceland, not a regional assembly of major consequence, but the kind of community gathering that happened at the local level throughout the Norse world whenever there was business to conduct, disputes to settle, decisions to make collectively. The thing was the fundamental institution of Norse civic life, and understanding what it was and how it worked is essential to understanding why. This morning, you are both the most important person at it and the least powerful. You are the business. Let's back up slightly and explain the thing in full, because it deserves the explanation and because what happens to you there is going to make more sense in context. The thing, the word simply means assembly, or thing, in the sense of a matter or affair, was the Norse legal and political assembly, where free men gathered to conduct the community's collective business. At the local level, it might be a handful of neighboring farms, gathering to resolve a boundary dispute or settle a debt. At the regional level, it was a formal legal court with established procedures. At the national level, the Icelandic Althing, established in 930 CE, is the most famous example. It was the closest thing the Norse world produced to a parliament, where laws were recited, major disputes adjudicated, and collective decisions made about matters affecting the whole community. The thing was not a democracy in the modern sense. Women could not participate as full legal persons, though their interests could be represented by male relatives. Slaves had no standing at all. Landless men had limited standing. The voices that carried weight were the voices of established free landowners, bondi, whose status gave them both the right and the social capital to be heard. But within those limitations, it was a remarkably participatory system. The Lögsugumadur, the law speaker, recited the law from memory because the law was not written down but maintained as an oral tradition. Disputes were argued, witnesses called, oaths sworn. Settlements were proposed and negotiated, judgments were rendered. The assembly itself was the authority. Not a king, not a priest, not an appointed official, but the gathered community of free men operating by the accumulated weight of law and custom. It was imperfect. The wealthy and well-connected had advantages that the poor and isolated did not. Violence and intimidation could influence outcomes. A man with many armed supporters behind him at the thing was in a different legal position than a man who stood alone. The law recognized this, obliquely, in various ways, but couldn't entirely eliminate it, none of which helps you, because you are standing at the edge of a gathering of perhaps 30 people. Farmers from this household, and neighboring ones, the 3 visitors from last night who apparently had reason to stay, some older men whose bearing suggests local authority. And you have just realized, from the way the conversation periodically orients toward you, that you are what they're here to discuss. The household head is speaking. He's telling your story, such as he understands it, which is, you arrived, you couldn't speak, you worked, you didn't cause trouble, you're still here, and still unexplained. His tone is neutral, neither advocating for you nor against you, presenting the facts as he knows them, and leaving the interpretation to the assembly. This is actually the correct procedure. He's not your patron, not your enemy, just the person in whose household you landed, fulfilling his civic obligation to bring your situation to the community's attention. Someone asks a question. Another person answers it. One of the visitors from last night, you think, though the gathering has shifted enough that you're having trouble tracking who is who. The exchange has the brisk, efficient quality of people who are used to conducting business with limited time and limited patience for ambiguity. And now someone is looking at you, directly, expectantly, with the expression of a person who has asked you something. You do the thing you've been doing all day. The spread hands, the expression of genuine incomprehension combined with genuine regret at the incomprehension. By now, you've practiced this enough that it comes out with a certain fluency. You can't speak, but you can mime speechlessness with some expertise. The reaction from the assembly is varied. Some people accept it immediately as the complete answer it is. Some people look skeptical, as if deliberate muteness is a more plausible explanation than genuine inability to communicate, and as if deliberate muteness in this context would be a serious strategic miscalculation on your part, which it would be. One older man, sitting slightly apart from the main group with the specific positioning of someone whose opinion matters enough that he doesn't need to perform engagement, is watching you with an expression you can't read at all. Let's talk about what the thing could decide about you, because the range of outcomes is wide, and they are not all comfortable. At the best end, you are recognized as a traveler of unknown origin, possibly a foreigner from a distant land, possibly someone with an unusual affliction affecting their speech, and the assembly decides to extend provisional hospitality for a defined period, another few days, a week, during which your situation might clarify itself. This is the optimistic scenario. It requires the assembly to conclude that you represent no threat, that the household can absorb the cost of your continued presence, and that the mystery of your origin is interesting rather than alarming. Further along the spectrum, you're assigned a formal status within the community, something like a household dependent, a laborer with specific obligations and specific protections, which places you within the social structure even if at the bottom of it. This is less comfortable but more stable. You have defined obligations, a defined position, and the legal protections, limited as they are at that level, that come with a recognized social slot. In exchange, you work, you contribute, you become part of the economic fabric of the household in a formalized way. Further still, you are determined to be a vagrant, an unknown without legitimate standing and expelled. Told to leave the community's territory and not come back. This puts you back on the road. In January, with nothing, which we've already established is a situation with a poor prognosis, but it's not violent. It's just a death sentence delivered at a polite distance. At the difficult end, you are determined to be a danger, or a thrall who has run away from another lord, or some category of person whose presence in the community creates legal liability. The assembly could, in certain circumstances, make a decision about you that involves neither hospitality nor expulsion, but something more permanent. The old man who has been watching you speaks. He speaks for a while, not performatively, not the practiced rhetoric of a man who likes the sound of his own voice at assemblies, but with the considered, specific cadence of someone who has thought about what he's going to say and is now saying it with precision. The assembly listens with the particular quality of attention that suggests this person's words carry weight. When he finishes, there is a pause that has the texture of people processing a perspective rather than simply waiting for the next speaker. The household head responds, then one of the visitors, then someone else. The exchange goes back and forth, not heated, not confrontational, but substantive. An actual deliberation, people with different views negotiating toward a collective conclusion. You stand in the cold and watch Norse democracy operate and try to read your fate from the body language of people whose language you don't speak, whose facial expressions you're still learning to decode, whose legal system you understand only in the broadest outline. It is genuinely one of the most helpless experiences imaginable. Not because anyone is being cruel. They're not. This is a genuine attempt to figure out the correct thing to do about a genuinely unusual situation. But because your entire future in this world, for however long you're in it, is being decided by a conversation you can't participate in, using criteria you don't fully understand, by people whose values and priorities are not entirely your values and priorities. This is the Viking Age. You don't get a lawyer. You don't get a translator provided by the court. You don't get to request an adjournment. You stand in the cold and you wait, and you try to look like the kind of person that a Norse community, gathering on a January morning, should decide to keep alive. The old man speaks again, shorter this time, a summary perhaps, or a recommendation. The assembly makes a sound, not unanimous, not dramatic, but the collective murmur of people reaching a conclusion they can live with. The household head looks at you. He says something, slow, clear, with the exaggerated enunciation of someone trying to communicate across a language gap and using volume to compensate for vocabulary. He says it twice. Then he does something you weren't expecting. He mimes. He points at you, then at the farm, then makes a gesture with his hands that takes a moment to read, and then resolves clearly into you here, staying, working. You are being kept, not as a guest. Guests have different status, different obligations. Not as a slave. The specific gestures don't have that character. As something in between, something that the Norse social vocabulary has a word for, and your modern vocabulary doesn't map neatly onto. A dependent, a ward, a person under the household's authority, and, crucially, under the household's protection. A person who is now in the social structure rather than outside it. You nod. The nod that means yes, I understand, I accept this, I will do what this requires. It is the most legally significant nod of your life, probably, ratifying an agreement whose terms you only partially understand in a language you don't speak, at a community assembly that you can't fully evaluate. But it is also unmistakably the right answer, because the alternative was expulsion into January, and you have an accurate understanding of what that means by now. The old man catches your eye as the assembly begins to disperse. He holds your gaze for a moment, not long, not dramatically, with an expression that you eventually interpret as, I advocated for you. The specific look of a person who made an argument on your behalf and is now communicating that the debt exists, not threateningly, but honestly. Acknowledgement that a thing happened and that you should know it happened. You nod at him too. A different nod, not the legal acceptance nod, but the human one. Thank you. I don't know who you are or why you helped me, but I understand that you did, and I'm not going to forget it. He nods back, turns, walks away in the direction of whichever neighboring farm is his. The thing is over. The community has conducted its business and dispersed back into the cold morning, back to their farms and their work and their lives. The brief civic occasion absorbed back into the ordinary day. You are still here. You have a status now. Low, defined largely by obligation rather than by rights, contingent on your continued usefulness and good behavior, embedded in a social structure you barely understand, but a status, a place in the order of things, a reason to be here that the community has formally, if minimally, endorsed. This is what the Viking Age required, above everything else: a place in the order of things, a recognized position in the network of obligation and community and mutual dependency that was the actual infrastructure of Norse society, beneath and behind all the drama of the raids and the sagas and the heroic poetry. The network was the thing, not the swords, not the ships. The network, the web, of relationships and obligations and recognized standings that told each person who they were in relation to everyone else and what that relationship required of them. You have the smallest possible thread in that network now, a single strand, provisional, newly created, dependent on the goodwill of people who owe you nothing and have given you something anyway. It is not nothing. In the Viking Age, in January, with nothing, a single thread is the difference between everything and its absence. Hold on to it. Conclusion, let's bring you home. The Longhouse morning is in full operation around you. The fire has been built back up. The porridge is on. The visitors from last night are preparing to leave, their departure as brisk and purposeful as their arrival. The household head is already outside, doing something that requires his attention before breakfast, because in the Viking Age, there is always something that requires attention before breakfast. You made it through the day, technically, marginally, with blistered hands and an aching back, and cold feet of continuing concern, and a caffeine withdrawal headache, and lungs that have been filtering Viking Age air for 24 hours and have opinions about it. You are not healthy. You are not comfortable. You are not anything that could honestly be called okay. But you're alive, and you're still here, and the household has not thrown you out, which means that tomorrow there will be more porridge and more work, and more cold, and more smoke, and more social navigation in a language you don't speak. Tomorrow will be harder in some ways, because the accumulated physical damage of today doesn't disappear overnight. It compounds. The blister will be more infected. The back will be stiffer before it loosens up. The sleep deficit will deepen. The nutritional gaps will widen. And easier in small ways, because some things are already slightly less terrifying than they were yesterday morning. The smoke is still awful, but you're slightly more adapted to it. The cold is still bone deep, but you know where the warmest spots in the Longhouse are. The language is still incomprehensible, but the faces have become familiar enough that you can read mood and intention with somewhat more accuracy. This is how the Viking Age worked. Not through dramatic displays of heroism, though those happened, but through the daily, grinding, undramatic accumulation of endurance, surviving another winter, getting through another week, making it to spring, when the ground thawed, and the sailing season opened, and the world expanded again from the tight, smoke-scented survival space of the January Longhouse to the wider possibilities of the Norse world. The people who lived this life, who did it not for one day, but for their entire lives, from birth to death, who knew nothing else and had no other reference point, deserve more than the caricature we've made of them. They deserve the respect of actually seeing them. Cold, working, complicated, violent, creative, enduring. They endured things that would break most modern people in a week. Not because they were superhuman, but because they were human in a context that demanded everything human beings are capable of continuously, without relief, from the moment they were born into it. You had one day, one cold, hard, smoky, painful, occasionally terrifying, genuinely extraordinary day in the world that made them. And you know now, in the specific way that only experience can teach, not the way you know something from a book or a documentary or a beautifully produced television drama, but in your hands and your back and your smoke-stinging eyes, what it actually meant to be alive in the Viking Age. It meant enduring. Every single day, it meant being shaped by cold and work and community and violence and story and fire, until the shape you were was exactly the shape the world required. You weren't that shape. You couldn't be in a day, but you stood in the same fire. And that, when you think about it, sitting on the sleeping bench in the cold, gray Viking morning with your bowl of porridge and your aching hands and your surviving, stubborn, deeply modern self, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything this day was ever going to give you. Take it. Go home.